Okay. So question one was as follows. When you look at underperforming real estate developments in Africa, what social infrastructure gaps show up more clearly, and how do they affect asset value over time? So I thought it was a very interesting question. I deliberately chose it because it gave me the opportunity to, first of all, outline what I consider the key components of social infrastructure, and then secondly, to throw up these gaps, that seem to permeate real estate housing provision in Africa, and of course, how they really do not do much to serve the interests of all the stakeholders involved in housing provision across the continent. Before I will start, I once again want to, thank the moderator, Mr. Yunusa, Halima, and all the participants to this webinar. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning for some of you. Before I proceed, however, I would like to do a deep dive into, before I proceed with a deep dive into the question, let us establish a few givens which will ultimately inform my answer. Number one given is as follows. Social infrastructure in both its physical and digital forms is key to human capital development, right? Improved livelihoods, and equally important to the achievement of the SDGs. 4 of those SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, as you know, 4 of those SDGs directly require enhanced and efficient social infrastructure interventions, particularly number 3, which has to do with good health and well-being, number 4, which has to do with qualitative education, number 6, which has to do with clean water and sanitation, and of course, the one that is particularly pertinent to me and my career, and that is number 11, sustainable cities and communities, right? Other SDGs also indirectly require social infrastructure intervention. The second given is that the financing gap for social infrastructure provision globally has been estimated to be between 800 billion US dollars, 800 billion, and US dollar 1 trillion annually through to 2030. This is massive. This shortfall is part of a broader $15 trillion infrastructure gap expected to peak by 2040 in the context of continued global population growth, right? The youth bulge in developing economies, and of course, rampant and rapid urbanization. The third given I would like to highlight is that the nexus between enhanced social infrastructure investment and national economic growth is inexorable. We cannot disconnect it there. A recent study by the Council of Europe Development Bank, CEB for short, focused on the correlation between educational investment and sustainable economic growth in the Guangdong province in China. Analyzed data from 21 cities in that province for between 2000 and 2016. The research ultimately found that there was an increase of 1% in education investment that led to an average 0.14% increase in the GDP for that province. So that correlation is there. The key message here is that investment in education, training, upskilling, reskilling, health, and energy efficient and accessible housing is central to increasing productivity and contribute to strong, resilient societies and sustainable growth. So the fourth given is we cannot overemphasize the importance of private capital and national government resources in effect, PPP frameworks in the provision of social infrastructure. We cannot be overstated. Same with the necessity for MDB, the financing by multilateral development banks, and of course we know most of them, mainly concessional financing through various instruments, including blended finance, green finance, risk guarantees, senior and subordinated debt instruments, and so on. And the last but not least given that I would like to point out in the interest of time is enhanced and efficient social infrastructure provision is a major, let's call it panacea or potential solution to the issue of rapid urbanization and its attendant effects such as the proliferation of slums, and then, of course, the insecurity, the health issues, the lack of the really very, very terrible living conditions associated with this proliferation of slums. Put another way, the proliferation of slums, characteristic of many cities of the world, is the direct result of the lack of proper provision of social infrastructure. So conversely, social infrastructure provision is key to addressing the growth of slums, to addressing out of control urbanization, and the growth of sustainable communities. Okay. I also like to posit that it's important that enhanced and efficient social infrastructure provision is key to the growth of secondary cities or other urban agglomerations that will help to address the issue of slum proliferation in these major cities. So having sort of outlined these givens as I understand it, I now come back to the question at hand, because I find that it is precisely the lack of these givens in several African cities and economies that really defines the deficit of social infrastructure provision on the continent. Again, the data on this is spotty, as you know, even though there's been some good work being done currently, by institutions like the AFDB in collaboration with the European Bank for Research and Development, with the IFC, UNDESA, and an institute called Africa Police, which is a project of the OECD, together with eGeopolis, with the eGeopolis Institute. So the data is still spotty anyway. Given that projections are that by 2050, Africa's urban population would have grown from 704 million to 1.4 billion, and that 2 out of 3 Africans will live in an urban area, thus increasing the demand for housing, physical, and social infrastructure. So, but you do a cursory look, and let me use Nigeria as an example, where I am currently. A cursory look at, cities, major cities like Abuja and Lagos, really highlights the lack of, what the consequences of the deficit of social infrastructure provision in these cities. Let me specifically use the example of Lagos. I don't know how many of you know that within the real estate sector, the current topic now is the demolition of Makoko, which, as you know, is a major slum, in Lagos, has been there for many, many decades. It has long been the poster boy for lack of provision of social infrastructure services. And of course, there are no plans for resettlements of the displaced persons. You go around Abuja, for example, many estates in Abuja and Lagos, we have developers who focus on just providing the brick and mortar before they even think of the hard infrastructure provisions such as power, roads, water, and so on, not to mention the softer ones like health clinics and so on. So you find a lot of estates with very poor roads, no power, with residents having to really provide these services by themselves. And of course, it really doesn't augur well for these estates, and really exacerbates an already bad situation in a lot of cases. So this is the reality that we face with in cities like Lagos and Abuja in Nigeria, and I'm sure it's the same for other major cities. Kano, Port Harcourt, and so on and so forth, as my Nigerian colleagues will testify. So what should we look at as the possible solutions to this? Number one, advocacy, really, really critical. Advocacy at both the public policy level and, of course, the private sector developer level, not to mention the citizenship level. Very, very important on the need to integrate the provision of social infrastructure in housing, national urban policy, housing provision, as well as real estate development. Now, that's one. Number two, greater regulations, regulatory control, and enforcement of building codes to ensure adherence and compliance with laid down rules and regulations concerning the provision of social infrastructure were captured. Number three, more efficient urban planning and governance, including projections as to future urban growth or future urban agglomerations. One of the major things I keep promoting as an outcome of my tenure with the Cities Alliance, which is part of the World Bank, was one of the products that we promoted in Cities Alliance, and that was what we call city development strategies. A framework which enabled for long-term visioning and planning for urban areas, that will include projections for population growth, and then projections for population growth will now automatically determine projections for hard infrastructure provisions like power, water, and so on, for soft infrastructure provisions, and so on. And then having the regulatory framework in place to enable the efficient and sustainable provision of such. So at least this is something we really need to integrate, to imbibe, to institutionalize in a lot of our urban planning processes across the continent. I know that quite a lot of work has already been done in this area, but obviously the verdict is yet out to be determined. So we still have our work cut out for us. So I would advocate for stronger planning, urban planning and governance systems and institutionalization of such. Another approach is use of PPP frameworks and the establishment of the enabling environment, both regulatory and otherwise, to make these frameworks work. For example, stronger capital market developments that will now enable issuance or the raising of capital, necessary capital to provide these infrastructure services, as in addition to national government or national budgetary allocations towards such, of course. And then incentivization of investment in social infrastructure. Really, what incentives do you offer to impact investors willing to come in and invest in health clinics, invest in schools, invest in waste management process, invest in water management and sanitation management? These are not charity investors. They also want to see some returns on their investments, So what incentives are there to enable them to do that? So I will stop there for now, because to my mind, unless we grapple with these major issues, we really cannot talk about, sustainable housing provision, sustainable urban growth, sustainable social infrastructure provision in many of our cities across Africa. So, of course, with multiplier consequences for all people, from the national government who are not able to realize the benefits of this, and have, still grapple with very poor human development indices, to the private sector, to even the citizens themselves, who continue to suffer the consequences of poor planning and poor implementation. I thank you. I'll rest for now. Thank you. But I would rather, reframe the question a different way. I would say that, if you prioritize the provision of social infrastructure, both the hard and the soft one, you're actually, sort of creating the opportunity for greater return on investment, the investment you put in that estate. Because once you have those amenities in place, do you know that you can now actually, transfer the cost of provision of those amenities to the bricks and mortars, the houses that you're actually providing? And of course, once you transfer the cost, once you sort of incorporate the cost in what you're in your sales price, of course, you have your greater return on investment. It's just the difference. For example, you provide a house to a subscriber without the roads or without water and without power, and you're forcing the subscriber to now maybe buy a generator to that. And then, in that respect, because you've not provided these other, both the basic and, hardcore, infrastructure, you are forced to sell at a much lower rate versus a developer who would first of all build the roads, provide the power, provide the water, provide the green spaces, provide the schools, or at least work with other investors to provide the schools, the health clinics, and so on. Because this is a win-win situation, and it requires a lot of thinking outside the box to actually do that. That developer will now be opportune to provide his property or his product at a much higher rate, to a clientele that'll be able to afford that much higher rate. I mean, this is a no-brainer. I know many of you have traveled abroad, especially in America, where I'm based. Before a developer actually thinks of building an estate, not only would they need to get approval from, of course, the local or county council to do that, but the council, he needs to ensure the provision of these basics before he begins to even put up a block in the name of the actual physical bricks of a house. So I think that is the culture we need to begin to bring into our system, especially in Nigeria. I know that is the case for example, in Egypt. I know they're building a massive new city, and within that city, it's an integrated approach. They've adopted a very integrated approach whereby not only the bricks and mortar, but also the hard infrastructure, the power systems, the road systems, airports, and so on, health clinics, hotels, hospitality industry, green spaces, everything is already in place. So that is what we need to imbibe, because to ensure sustainability for the medium to long term and avoid what I had earlier referred to as the proliferation of, slums. Because ultimately, estates without these services eventually turn into slums. Eventually turn into slums. And while I have the floor, please, Mr. Moderator, I would also like to comment on question number 6 that my fellow panelists talked about, because it was the second question that I chose out of the 2 that I was asked to choose. And that is, what would you refuse to compromise on in terms of social infrastructure provision if you're underwriting a city? I thought it was a difficult question because, I believe all these services are interrelated or integrated with housing provision as the connector to promote housing, land, enabling regulatory environment, hard infrastructure like roads, power, etc. Soft ones like schools, health clinics, water and sanitation need to be provided. Perhaps a better way to frame the question would be, which one would you prioritize if you have a lot of priorities? In that respect, apart from the physical shelter provision, I'll probably start off. It's a starting off because as an investor, you think of, okay, where do I get what will give me the maximum return? Where is more efficient for me to start my investments from? I will probably start off with, apart from the actual provision of the house, with ensuring efficient energy provision, water and sanitation, then over to the rest, as all these are linked to good health. And as we all know, as we all say, according to the adage, health is wealth. And, in that order, I'll probably do it. But it's not a question of which one would I say no to. There's none you can say no. You just have to maybe prioritize the order of provision of these social infrastructure services.